You listen to me. I can have you removed from this plane immediately.
No, Captain. I am taking control of this situation. I need you to calm down and return to the cockpit.
The morning had been relentless. Marcus Williams sat in the back seat of the town car, watching Atlanta's sprawling downtown skyline fade as they approached Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. His phone buzzed incessantly with emails, each one marked urgent, each one demanding a piece of his already fractured attention. As the director of the Federal Aviation Administration, Marcus had grown accustomed to living at the intersection of bureaucracy and crisis management. There was always another problem that needed solving, another decision that couldn't wait. Today was particularly demanding. He just finished a 3-hour meeting with senators about new safety regulations, and now he was headed to a closed-door session with international aviation officials in New York. The car pulled smoothly into the departures lane, and Marcus gathered his belongings with practiced efficiency. Walking through the bustling terminal, Marcus noticed the usual chaos of a busy airport. Families hurried toward gates, business travelers moved with singular purpose, and announcements echoed overhead in that distinctive cadence that airports had perfected over decades. He'd walked through thousands of terminals in his career, both as an engineer, as an administrator, and now in his current role. There was something about airports that he loved, the sense of possibility, the feeling that from any gate, someone was embarking on a journey that mattered to them. Children pressed their noses against windows to watch planes, elderly couples held hands as they navigated the terminals, students studied flight information boards with nervous anticipation. These airports, he'd always believed, represented America at its best, a place where people of all backgrounds came together with a singular purpose. The VIP lounge was located on the East Concourse, accessible only to members or those traveling first class. Marcus had earned his platinum membership years ago through frequent travel, and it had become his sanctuary during the hectic days that defined his position. As he walked toward the private elevator that would take him to the exclusive floor, he reflected on how far he'd come. His childhood had been modest, his father a mechanic, his mother a schoolteacher. Neither had traveled extensively, and the idea of exclusive lounges would have seemed impossibly luxurious to them. Yet here he was, ascending to a private refuge that cost more per year to maintain than his parents had earned in a month. It wasn't vanity that drew him to the lounge, it was necessity. In spaces like this, he could breathe. He could work without constant interruptions, could think without the sensory overload of a commercial terminal. The elevator doors slid open on the 4th floor, and Marcus stepped into the VIP lounge. Immediately, the temperature seemed to cool, the air to settle. The autumn afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the tarmac. He could see the massive aircraft lined up like metallic birds waiting to take flight, a view that never got old no matter how many times he witnessed it. The lounge itself was a study in understated elegance. The furniture was cream-colored, arranged in intimate conversational groupings that encouraged quiet dialogue rather than the chaos of the main terminal. The walls were a soft beige, adorned with abstract art that suggested sophistication without screaming it. Soft jazz music played from invisible speakers, a live trio performing standards that had been classics for decades. Somewhere, someone was probably preparing champagne and hors d'oeuvres in the culinary area, though Marcus had never developed much appetite during travel. He took in the other occupants of the lounge with a quick, practiced glance. There was a woman in her 60s working on a laptop, her reading glasses perched on her nose, her expression suggesting she was deep in concentration about something important. A younger man, perhaps in his 40s, was on a phone call, speaking in hushed tones that suggested a confidential business discussion. 2 older gentlemen sat in one of the conversational groupings, reviewing what looked like financial documents. An elderly couple sat near the window, the woman's hand resting gently on the man's arm as they watched the planes. These were Marcus's peers in this space, the frequent flyers, the business elite, the wealthy, the important. The lounge was like a club, and these were its members. It was a place where differences often melted away because everyone present shared the common language of privilege, of importance, of belonging to a certain tier of society. Marcus approached the reception desk, where a woman named Jennifer was organizing reservation books with meticulous care. She'd been working the lounge for the 3 years that Marcus had been regularly visiting this particular space, and she'd always been unfailingly professional and kind. She looked up as he approached, and her face immediately broke into a warm smile of recognition. "Mr. Williams, good afternoon," she said, her tone suggesting she was genuinely pleased to see him. "The usual. We have a lovely aged cheddar and some fresh imported olives today, and the champagne selection is particularly good this week." Marcus returned her smile, feeling a wave of relief at this simple moment of recognition and welcome. "That sounds wonderful, Jennifer, and perhaps some sparkling water with lemon. I have a flight to New York in a couple of hours and a long evening ahead." "Of course, sir. I'll have it ready for you right away. Your usual seat by the window is open, or I can set up the conference room if you need privacy for work." "The window seat is perfect," Marcus said, already moving toward the window-side seating area. "I just need a moment to decompress before the flight." He settled into the comfortable chair, watching the planes through the window. A massive Boeing 777 was pulling away from its gate, and Marcus found himself thinking about the thousands of safety protocols, maintenance procedures, and regulatory frameworks that had to align perfectly to get that aircraft safely into the air. It was his responsibility in many ways to ensure that all of those pieces worked together seamlessly. The weight of that responsibility had never fully left his shoulders since he'd taken the position. Every plane that took off safely felt like a small victory. Every accident, every incident, every safety concern weighed on him in a way that no amount of success could fully offset. Jennifer arrived with his sparkling water, the glass beaded with condensation, a lemon slice perfectly positioned on the rim. Marcus thanked her and settled back with his phone, beginning to sort through the mounting emails. The afternoon light was beginning to shift, casting golden hues across the lounge. Everything felt perfect, calm, serene. The world outside the lounge was chaotic and demanding, but in here he had carved out a space of peace. He had no way of knowing that this peace was about to be dramatically disrupted, that in the next 30 minutes, his quiet afternoon would transform into a moment that would define a conversation far larger than himself. For now, he simply sat with his water, his phone, and the knowledge that he belonged here. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. Captain Richard Harrison had been flying commercial aircraft for 32 years, and in that time, he had developed a keen sense of observation. It came with the territory. A pilot, he believed, had to read situations, assess threats, evaluate risk. This skill had kept him safe in cockpits during turbulent weather and difficult landings. Over the decades, it had become second nature, this constant scanning of his environment, this cataloging of details, this quiet assessment of who belonged and who didn't. He'd built a reputation as one of the most reliable pilots at Delta Airlines, someone who could be counted on not just to fly the plane, but to maintain order, to ensure everything ran according to protocol. His superiors respected his adherence to procedure, his unwillingness to cut corners, his insistence that rules existed for a reason. Captain Harrison was sitting in his usual corner of the VIP lounge that afternoon, a location he'd claimed as his office away from the office over the years. From this seat, he had a clear view of the entire lounge, the entrance, the reception desk, the seating areas, everything. He preferred it this way. Control, he'd always believed, came from awareness. He was on a 4-day layover in Atlanta, having just completed a long-haul flight from London, and he was enjoying a bourbon on the rocks, something he allowed himself only when he wasn't flying the next day. The newspaper lay folded on his lap, though he hadn't been reading it. Instead, he was people-watching, a habit that had grown more pronounced as he'd aged. He liked to observe the other business travelers, to imagine where they were going and why. That's when Marcus walked in. Harrison noticed him immediately, though he couldn't have explained exactly why. Maybe it was the way Marcus moved, with a kind of assured purposefulness that suggested someone accustomed to belonging in exclusive spaces. Or maybe it was simply that Marcus stood out slightly from the typical afternoon crowd. Harrison watched as Marcus approached the reception desk, noted the warm greeting from Jennifer, observed how familiar their exchange seemed. The pilot's eyes narrowed slightly, a barely perceptible contraction of the muscles around his eyes that signaled the beginning of his assessment process. Something about the scene bothered Harrison, though he still couldn't articulate precisely what. He told himself it was nothing, that he was simply being observant, as he always was. Yet his eyes kept drifting back to Marcus as the younger man settled into a seat by the window. Marcus pulled out his phone, began attending to emails with the kind of focused intensity that suggested important business. He'd ordered sparkling water with lemon, a detail Harrison found himself cataloging. Not a drinker then, professional, careful, but something still felt off. Harrison had spent 32 years in an industry that was, despite all the progress of recent decades, still predominantly white and male. The vast majority of his colleagues looked like him. They came from similar backgrounds, shared similar assumptions, moved through the world with a kind of unquestioned authority. He'd worked alongside women pilots, certainly, and pilots from various ethnic backgrounds, but the cockpit was still, in many ways, a club of a particular type. And the VIP lounge Harrison had observed over the years seemed to reflect this same demographic reality. The successful business people who occupied this space, the CEOs, the executives, the important people, tended to look a certain way. As Harrison sat with his bourbon, a thought began to form in his mind, crystallizing slowly like ice forming on a winter windshield. It started as an almost unconscious assumption. Someone who looked like Marcus in his assessment simply didn't fit the profile of a typical VIP lounge member. Harrison told himself he wasn't being prejudiced. He was simply being observant, reading the room, doing what he'd trained himself to do for 3 decades. He noted that Marcus appeared to be alone, which wasn't unusual. He noted that Marcus was dressed well, which was to be expected. But beneath these surface observations, something deeper was operating, a set of assumptions about who was likely to have earned the privilege of membership in this exclusive space. It took him nearly 15 minutes of internal debate before Harrison decided to act. He sat with his thoughts, wrestling with them silently. Part of him recognized that approaching this stranger would be unusual, would draw attention. Another part of him, the part that had been trained to notice anomalies and address them, felt a growing sense of duty. If someone didn't belong in the VIP lounge, shouldn't it be addressed? Wasn't it his responsibility, as a senior member of the aviation community, to maintain the integrity of these spaces? By the time Harrison set down his drink and stood up, he had convinced himself that he was doing the right thing. He wasn't being racist, he told himself. He was being vigilant. He was protecting the sanctity of this exclusive space. He'd read an article somewhere about sophisticated fraud schemes where people attempted to access restricted areas by impersonating members. That could be what was happening here. That was entirely plausible. And if it was, then his intervention would be not just appropriate but necessary. He straightened his uniform jacket, a habit from decades of maintaining military precision discipline, and began walking toward Marcus's seat. As he approached, Harrison's mind was already constructing a narrative. He would be polite but firm. He would ask Marcus to verify his membership. If Marcus became defensive or evasive, that would confirm Harrison's suspicions. If he was legitimate, then a brief explanation would clear everything up, and Harrison could return to his seat knowing he'd done his due diligence. The captain's bearing straightened even further, his posture becoming more rigid, more authoritative. He'd been trained to command respect, to project authority, and 3 decades of practice had made this as natural as breathing. When he reached Marcus's side, Harrison deliberately positioned himself so that others in the lounge could see him, could hear him. In his mind, this wasn't rudeness. It was professionalism. It was the action of someone with enough confidence and authority to address potential issues openly rather than discreetly. He looked down at Marcus with an expression that mixed curiosity with skepticism, the look of someone who had caught something amiss. "Excuse me," he said, his voice loud enough for nearby patrons to notice. "I don't recognize you as a regular member of this lounge. I've been coming here for many years and I pride myself on knowing the community." He paused, letting the words settle, letting them do their work. "Are you certain you're supposed to be in here? Perhaps there's been some confusion about where you're seated." The question hung in the air, deceptively polite on the surface, but laden with accusation beneath. Other conversations in the lounge seemed to quiet slightly. A woman at a nearby table glanced up from her coffee. The elderly couple near the window stopped their murmured conversation. Harrison stood with his arms crossed, waiting for Marcus to respond, his face suggesting he'd caught someone precisely where they weren't supposed to be. In that moment, Captain Richard Harrison was entirely convinced that he was simply doing his job, maintaining order, protecting the integrity of an exclusive space. He had no idea what he was actually doing and what the consequences would be. The words hit Marcus like a punch, though his face registered barely a flicker of reaction. He'd learned over the course of his life that the first moment after an insult was critical. How you responded in those initial seconds determined the entire trajectory of the encounter. He'd been through this before, not exactly like this, never quite in such a public setting, never from someone in uniform, but the underlying structure of the moment was familiar. It was the microaggression, the challenge to legitimacy, the subtle suggestion that he didn't belong. It was a feeling that had become almost mundane in his experience, so common that he developed a kind of sophisticated armor against it. Marcus set down his phone deliberately, slowly, buying himself a moment to think. The screen went dark, and he took a breath. In that single breath, he made a decision. He would not give this man the satisfaction of anger. He would not raise his voice. He would not become the angry black man responding to perceived disrespect, because that was exactly the narrative that would be constructed if he did. Instead, he would become something far more powerful. He would become the embodiment of unshakable confidence and professionalism. He would become the person who didn't need to prove himself, because his actual accomplishments spoke louder than any words. Slowly, Marcus turned to face Captain Harrison directly. His eyes met the older man's gaze without flinching. There was a quality to his expression that immediately shifted the dynamic of the encounter, not aggressive, but utterly composed. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth, the kind of smile that suggested he understood something the captain didn't, that he was already several steps ahead in this chess game that was just beginning. "Captain," Marcus began, his voice steady and measured, with the kind of calm authority that comes from someone genuinely comfortable with who they are. "I assure you I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." He paused for a moment, letting those words settle, letting them hang in the air between them. Around the lounge, Marcus could sense the atmosphere shifting. The woman with the coffee cup had definitely stopped what she was doing. He could feel eyes on him, sense the collective intake of breath. Jennifer at the reception desk had gone very still. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket with a deliberate, unhurried motion. There was no fumbling, no nervousness, no hint of someone who was caught off guard or afraid. He moved with the precision of someone who had done this many times before, because he had. He withdrew his credentials folder and placed it on the armrest of his chair, positioning it so that Harrison, and anyone else looking, could see it clearly. "Perhaps you might take a look at these," Marcus continued, his tone neither hostile nor submissive. It was the tone of someone speaking to an equal, maybe even someone speaking to someone below their station, though he managed to do it without the slightest hint of condescension. This was a crucial balance. He wasn't going to make Harrison feel small. That would only entrench his defensiveness. Instead, Marcus was going to simply present the facts and let them speak for themselves. The badge gleamed under the lounge's soft lighting. The credentials were immediately recognizable to anyone in the aviation industry, a government-issued ID with official seals and Marcus's photograph. Even from a distance, even without being able to read the small print, anyone who worked in aviation would understand what they were looking at. This wasn't a corporate badge. This wasn't an airline membership card. This was federal government identification. Harrison's face had gone absolutely still. He didn't reach for the credentials. Instead, his eyes simply fixed on them, scanning the information from where he stood. Marcus watched the captain's expression carefully, reading the micro-expressions that played across his face like a film in fast forward. First came confusion, the slight furrow of the brow. Then came doubt, the way his eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Then came something that looked almost like concern. The captain's jaw tightened visibly. Around the lounge, conversations had died entirely. The ambient jazz seemed suddenly too loud, too cheerful for the moment unfolding. The woman with the coffee cup had set it down, her hands folded in her lap, her attention entirely focused on Marcus and the captain. The elderly gentleman with the financial documents had removed his reading glasses, watching with the intensity of someone who was witnessing something significant. The young man who had been on the phone call had ended his conversation, pocketing his phone to give the encounter his full attention. Marcus remained perfectly still, waiting. He understood the power of silence, understood that this moment belonged to Harrison now. The captain was processing something, and Marcus had learned long ago that the most powerful response to confrontation wasn't always more words. Sometimes it was the absence of words, the calm certainty of someone who knew that time and facts were on their side. Jennifer broke the silence first, shifting slightly at her desk. There was a quality to her body language that suggested she was debating whether to intervene. Marcus gave her the slightest shake of his head, a tiny gesture that said, "I've got this. Let this play out." She relaxed slightly but remained alert, clearly concerned about how the situation would develop. "I've been in public service for a long time, Captain," Marcus said finally, his voice perhaps even quieter than before, which somehow made it more powerful. "And I've learned that sometimes people make assumptions. Not always malicious assumptions, but assumptions nonetheless. They see what they expect to see." He paused, watching Harrison's face carefully. "They see the uniform, they see the setting, and they construct a narrative about who belongs and who doesn't, and sometimes they're wrong." There was no anger in his tone. That was the remarkable thing. There was no recrimination, no suggestion of future consequences, no hint of the power differential that was about to become glaringly obvious. There was only a kind of gentle correction, the way a teacher might gently correct a student who had arrived at the wrong answer. "I'm sure your intentions were good, Captain," Marcus continued. "I'm sure you thought you were protecting something. That's understandable. But I want to be clear. I don't need protection from belonging in this space. I belong here, definitively, unquestionably. And I think once you take a closer look at those credentials, you'll understand why that's the case." The older man with the financial documents leaned slightly toward his companion, whispering something. Marcus caught only fragments, FAA, and Director, but it was enough. The information was already spreading through the lounge like electricity through a circuit. By the time Harrison finally looked back at the credentials and read them fully, every other person in the lounge already understood what he was about to discover. That understanding, the fact that his humiliation was about to be public and irreversible, hung over Captain Richard Harrison like a storm cloud. Captain Harrison's eyes finally moved down to the credentials, his gaze landing first on the photograph. It was Marcus, unmistakably, the same man sitting before him, the same composed expression, the same sense of quiet authority radiating from the image. Harrison's eyes traveled lower, seeking out the title. At first, the words didn't quite register. His brain was reading them. His eyes were processing the letters. But there was a delay between visual input and comprehension, as if his mind was refusing to accept what he was seeing. Federal Aviation Administration. His eyes jumped back to the title line, seeking clarification, hoping perhaps he'd misread. But the words were unchanged, printed in clear official font. Director. The single word sat on the page like a bomb with a ticking timer. For a moment, just a fraction of a second that felt like an eternity, Captain Harrison's entire body went rigid. His hands, which had been hanging at his sides, suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else. His breathing, which had been normal moments before, became shallow. The bourbon he'd been drinking seemed to turn to acid in his stomach. Marcus Williams, Director of the Federal Aviation Administration. The implications cascaded through Harrison's consciousness like a series of dominoes falling in slow motion. The FAA, the organization that regulated every aspect of his professional life, the organization that issued his commercial pilot's license, the organization that conducted safety audits on his airline, the organization that had the authority to ground him, to revoke his license, to end a 32-year career with a single decision. And standing before him, no, sitting before him, was the man who headed that entire organization, the man at the very top of the chain of command, the director. Harrison's face had gone completely pale, not just pale, ashen. The color seemed to drain from his complexion like water from a bathtub, leaving behind a sickly gray tone that made him look suddenly older, frailer, diminished. His jaw hung slightly open, though no sound came out. His mind was racing, spinning, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what he'd just done. What he'd done. The words echoed in his head like an accusation. He just publicly questioned, challenged, and insulted the director of the Federal Aviation Administration. He'd done it loudly enough for multiple witnesses to hear. He'd done it in a tone that carried accusation and suspicion. He'd done it based on nothing more than his own biased assumptions about who belonged in an exclusive space. And now, the man he'd insulted held more power over his professional destiny than anyone else in the entire aviation industry. Harrison's hands began to tremble slightly. It was just a small tremor, barely noticeable, but it was there, the physical manifestation of shock beginning to set in. Around the lounge, he could sense that others had noticed. The woman with the coffee cup was no longer pretending to be engaged with anything other than what was happening in front of her. The elderly gentleman had leaned over and whispered something to his companion, and both men were now watching Harrison with expressions that ranged from pity to barely concealed satisfaction. Even Jennifer at the reception desk had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. I didn't. Harrison's voice emerged barely above a whisper, and the words immediately felt inadequate, insufficient, completely unable to address the gravity of the situation. His mind was screaming, but his voice had reduced itself to stammering fragments. That is, Director Williams, He couldn't finish the sentence. What was there to say? What could possibly be said in this moment that wouldn't make things worse? Every word he spoke felt like it was potentially being recorded, archived, documented for the purposes of whatever investigation would inevitably follow. Because there would be an investigation. There had to be. He'd publicly questioned and challenged the director of the FAA based on racial assumptions. This was the kind of incident that made national news. This was the kind of moment that defined careers, in this case, by destroying them. The realization seemed to hit Harrison in waves, each one more devastating than the last. First came the personal humiliation. He'd made a fool of himself in front of dozens of witnesses, his prejudice exposed and undeniable. Then came the professional panic, the understanding that his employment might be in jeopardy, that his pension might be vulnerable, that everything he'd built over 32 years might be crumbling. But deeper than either of those came something more fundamental, the recognition that Marcus Williams, as director of the FAA, had the power to make his life very, very difficult. The FAA could conduct surprise audits of his airline. They could scrutinize his flying record with a microscope, looking for any violation, any technical infraction, any reason to ground him. They could make an example of him. They could ensure that he became the cautionary tale that was circulated through the pilot community, the story of the man who questioned the wrong person. Even if they never explicitly took action against him, Even if they never explicitly retaliated, the shadow of this moment would follow him for the rest of his career. Every incident, every evaluation, every review would be conducted in the context of this confrontation. And it was his own fault. His own biased assumptions had created this nightmare. Harrison's eyes looked down at the credentials again as if he might have somehow misread them the first time, but they remained the same. Marcus Williams, Director, Federal Aviation Administration. The words didn't change, no matter how many times he read them. The reality remained constant and immutable. Director Williams, I sincerely apologize, Harrison began, his voice now carrying a note of desperation beneath the stammering. I made a terrible mistake. I shouldn't have. I didn't mean to. He trailed off again, recognizing the futility of trying to explain away what he'd done. Around the lounge, the atmosphere had shifted completely. What had been a moment of tension was now a moment of reckoning. The ambient jazz continued to play, indifferent to the human drama unfolding, but it seemed almost mockingly cheerful given the gravity of the situation. Several other patrons had openly stopped what they were doing to watch. Even the elevator doors, when they opened to admit a new arrival, seemed to do so more quietly, as if the entire lounge had somehow sensed the magnitude of what was occurring and had collectively decided to bear witness. Harrison glanced around, suddenly aware that this wasn't just between him and Director Williams. This was public. This was witnessed. This was documented in the memories and potentially in the phones of a dozen people scattered throughout the lounge. There was no way to contain this, no way to make it private, no way to apologize and move on as if this moment had never happened. The consequences, whatever they would be, were already beginning. The panic didn't arrive gradually. It crashed over Captain Richard Harrison like a wave, completely submerging him, pulling him under into depths where rational thought became impossible. His mouth went completely dry, so dry that when he tried to speak again, his voice emerged as barely more than a croak, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep within him, from a place of primal distress. I sincerely apologize, Director Williams, he stammered, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. I made a terrible mistake. I shouldn't have. I didn't mean to suggest. He stopped, recognizing the inadequacy of his words, the futility of trying to explain or justify what he'd done. How could he possibly explain it? How could he articulate the unconscious bias that had driven him to challenge a man based on nothing more than his appearance? There was no explanation that wouldn't sound like a pitiful excuse. His hands, which moments before had been crossed authoritatively over his chest, now fell to his sides as if the bones had turned to water. They trembled visibly, small involuntary movements that he couldn't control and couldn't hide. He lifted one hand to his face, running it across his forehead in a gesture that was purely nervous, purely a manifestation of his internal panic leaking out into his physical form. Sweat had begun to form on his upper lip, and he was acutely aware of it, acutely aware that this physical response was further evidence of his guilt, his shame, his complete understanding of what he'd done. I apologize profusely, sir, Harrison continued, his voice now taking on a quality of desperation that was palpable to everyone in the lounge. There's no excuse. I made an assumption that was completely unfounded and I acted on it without cause. It was unprofessional. It was inappropriate. It was. He searched for the words, but there seemed to be no words adequate to the moment. It was wrong. The admission hung in the air like a confession extracted under duress. Around the lounge, Harrison could feel the weight of observation pressing down on him like a physical force. The woman with the coffee cup was leaning slightly forward in her chair now, her expression a mixture of pity and satisfaction. The elderly gentleman who had whispered to his companion earlier was openly shaking his head in disapproval. Jennifer at the reception desk had her hand still over her mouth, her eyes wide with the kind of shock that suggested she understood the magnitude of what had just occurred. Even the young man who had been conducting his confidential business call had repositioned himself to get a better view of the unfolding drama. Harrison's gaze darted around the lounge, taking in each witness, each observer, each person whose memory would preserve this moment forever. The realization crashed over him again and again in waves. This wasn't something that would stay private. This wasn't something he could control or contain. Multiple people had witnessed his humiliation, and in an era of smartphones and social media, the details would likely be preserved and shared. He could already imagine it, the story spreading through the aviation community, the pilot community, possibly even the general public. Pilot questions FAA director's right to be in VIP lounge. The headlines wrote themselves. "I have no excuse," Harrison continued, his voice now taking on a quality of genuine remorse that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within him. "I base my challenge entirely on assumptions I made about you based on. He couldn't even finish the sentence. Saying based on your race out loud would make it undeniably real, would be an explicit admission of racism that he wasn't sure he was prepared to make, even though the evidence was overwhelming. Marcus remained completely still, watching Harrison with an expression that was difficult to read. There was no visible anger, but neither was there sympathy. It was the expression of someone who had been placed in this exact position before, who had learned long ago how to witness another person's reckoning without allowing his own emotions to be pulled into the vortex. Harrison took a step backward, as if physically distancing himself from Marcus would somehow reduce the weight of what he'd done. It didn't. Instead, it only seemed to highlight the power dynamic that had shifted so completely in the space of a few minutes. He'd walked up to Marcus from a position of assumed authority, certain in his right to question and challenge. Now he was retreating, diminished, his authority completely evaporated. I've flown for 32 years, Harrison heard himself saying, almost as if someone else was speaking the words. I've had a reputation as someone who follows protocol, who maintains standards, and I've just violated the most basic protocol of all, which is to treat people with dignity and respect. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. He was aware that he might be on the verge of tears, and the thought of crying in front of all these witnesses only added to his sense of degradation. The lounge seemed to have gone completely silent. Even the ambient jazz seemed quieter, as if the entire space had conspired to focus entirely on this moment of reckoning. The elevator doors opened at one point, and someone began to exit before apparently sensing the tension and retreating back inside, allowing the doors to close again. The moment felt suspended in time, like a photograph that captured something essential about human nature. The moment when a person finally understood the full weight of their own prejudice. Harrison's mind was spiraling now, moving beyond the immediate shame and into the territory of practical consequences. His career, his pension, his reputation, his standing in the pilot community. All of it seemed to be crumbling right here, right now, in real time. He'd spent 32 years building a reputation, and in less than 5 minutes he'd potentially destroyed it entirely. Director Williams, I understand if you feel the need to take action. If there are consequences, I accept them, Harrison said, and these words seemed to come from a place of genuine acceptance, of someone who understood that he'd set his own fate in motion and now had to live with it. I was wrong, completely, unequivocally wrong, and I'm deeply sorry. The apology sounded hollow to his own ears, completely inadequate to address the magnitude of his transgression. He'd questioned the legitimacy of the director of the Federal Aviation Administration based on racial assumptions, and no apology in the world would undo that. The witnesses would remember, the story would spread, and Marcus Williams, the man he just insulted, was the one person in the aviation industry with the power to make his remaining years in the profession extremely difficult. Harrison stood there, waiting for a response, his entire body radiating shame and panic. Around him, the lounge seemed to contract, the walls closing in, the space becoming smaller and more suffocating. He'd come to the VIP lounge seeking a moment of peace and relaxation. Instead, he'd found himself in the center of a moment that would define the remainder of his professional life. The silence stretched on, and in that silence Captain Richard Harrison began to understand the true cost of his assumptions. Marcus took a moment before responding, allowing the silence to settle fully over the lounge. He understood the power of that silence, understood that what he said next would reverberate far beyond this moment, far beyond this particular exchange between two men in an airport lounge. Everything that happened in the next few minutes would become part of the larger conversation, part of the narrative that would inevitably spread. He needed to be intentional. He needed to be thoughtful. He needed to transform this moment from a simple confrontation into something meaningful. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried an undeniable weight. There was no anger in it. That was perhaps the most striking thing. Many people might have expected anger. Many people might have expected Marcus to use this moment to punish Harrison, to leverage his power, to make the captain feel as small as possible. Instead, Marcus's tone carried something far more complex, a combination of disappointment, understanding, and an unwavering commitment to something larger than personal vindication. "Captain Harrison," Marcus began, his words carefully chosen and measured, "what happened here today illustrates something I encounter far too often in my work, and I want to take a moment to address it, not just for you, but for everyone listening." The lounge had become so quiet that Marcus's voice seemed almost amplified, despite his speaking softly. He rose slightly from his seat, gathering himself, preparing to deliver what would become the most important words of this encounter. Around him, people had leaned forward slightly, sensing that something significant was about to be articulated. "You made an assumption about me based entirely on my appearance," Marcus continued, his eyes meeting Harrison's directly. "You saw me in this space, and rather than assuming I belonged here, rather than giving me the basic courtesy of accepting that I might have a legitimate reason to be in this exclusive lounge, you questioned my legitimacy. You challenged my right to be here, and you did it publicly, loudly enough for others to hear. That matters." Harrison stood absolutely still, his face a mask of misery and attention, clearly understanding that he was about to be issued a profound lesson about his own behavior. "But what I want to talk about goes deeper than just your individual decision to confront me," Marcus said. "What I want to talk about is something called unconscious bias. It's not something unique to you, Captain. It's something that exists in all of us to varying degrees. It's the product of living in a society where certain narratives have been repeated so often that they've become almost invisible to us. Narratives about who succeeds, who belongs in exclusive spaces, who is likely to be important or influential." Marcus paused, letting that sink in. The woman with the coffee cup had set it down completely now, her full attention on him. The elderly gentleman had removed his glasses entirely and was watching intently. Even Jennifer at the desk seemed to be hanging on every word. "The reason I'm taking time to address this publicly," Marcus continued, "is because unconscious bias doesn't just hurt individuals. It affects entire industries. It affects the aviation industry specifically, which has a long history of excluding people who look like me from positions of authority and leadership. When I became the director of the FAA, I was aware that many people would have assumptions about my qualifications, about whether I truly belonged in this position. And incidents like what just happened here, they reinforce those narratives. They perpetuate the idea that people who look like me are somehow less likely to be in positions of power and prestige." Marcus gestured slightly toward Harrison, not in an accusatory way, but in a way that included the captain in the larger conversation. "Captain, I don't believe you woke up this morning intending to be prejudiced. I don't think you came to this lounge planning to confront someone based on race. That's not how unconscious bias works. It operates beneath the level of conscious intent. It operates through the small decisions we make every day, who we question, who we give the benefit of the doubt to, who we assume belongs and who we assume doesn't." The silence that followed was profound. Even the ambient jazz seemed to have faded into the background, as if the lounge itself was listening. I've spent my entire career working to change these systems, Marcus said, his voice taking on a tone that suggested he was speaking not just to Harrison, but to everyone in the space, and perhaps to a larger audience beyond. I became an engineer because I loved aviation. I moved into administration because I wanted to help shape policy, and I accepted this position as director because I still believe, that representation matters. When people see someone who looks like them in positions of authority, it changes what they believe is possible. It changes the narratives. He turned his gaze directly to Harrison again. What I need from you, Captain, is not just an apology. Apologies are important, and I appreciate yours. But what I need is for you to think deeply about this moment. I need you to examine the assumptions you make about people. I need you to recognize that the next time you're inclined to question someone's legitimacy based on appearance, you pause and ask yourself why. What is the actual evidence for my skepticism? Am I making an assumption based on race or gender or some other characteristic? Or am I making a decision based on actual information? Marcus picked up his phone from the armrest, tucking it carefully into his jacket pocket. He stood now, preparing to move away, preparing to reclaim the privacy and peace that had been disrupted moments before. This incident will likely become public, Marcus said calmly. I'm not going to threaten you with investigations or consequences, Captain, but I will say this. This moment can either be a catalyst for personal change, or it can be something you try to minimize and explain away. I hope you choose the former. I hope you use this as an opportunity to become better, not just as a pilot, but as a human being who interacts with people from all backgrounds. He gathered his belongings with deliberate calm. I'm not here to destroy your career. I'm not here for vengeance, but I am committed to accountability. I'm committed to the idea that when we hurt people through our biases, we need to acknowledge it, learn from it, and do better going forward. That's what I expect from you. Marcus moved away from his seat, walking toward the quieter corner of the lounge, his composure never wavering. As he passed, several other patrons seemed to shrink slightly, as if in the presence of something larger than themselves. Jennifer at the desk watched him with an expression of respect and admiration. Behind him, Captain Richard Harrison stood alone, completely diminished, transformed by the weight of Marcus's words into a man who finally understood the depth of what he'd done and what it meant. The lounge had witnessed not just a confrontation, but a transformation, a moment where one man had used his power not to punish, but to teach. The implications of Marcus's response would echo far beyond this afternoon. The story might have remained contained to the memories of those present in the VIP lounge if not for one crucial detail. One of the witnesses was Sarah Chen, a freelance travel journalist who had been working on an article about premium airport lounges for a major online publication. She had been sitting in the corner, ostensibly working on her laptop, but she had witnessed the entire exchange. More importantly, she had recorded the final portion of Marcus's response on her phone, capturing his words about unconscious bias and systemic change. Within hours of the incident, Sarah had filed a preliminary report. Within 24 hours, her story had appeared online with the headline, FAA Director Confronted in Airport VIP Lounge by Pilot Who Didn't Recognize Him. The article was detailed, balanced, and powerful. She quoted extensively from witnesses, described the scene meticulously, and included the video of Marcus's final statement. The story exploded across social media like wildfire. By the second day, it had been picked up by every major news outlet in the country. CNN ran it as a breaking story. The New York Times published an in-depth analysis. Twitter erupted into passionate debate about racism, unconscious bias, and accountability. The hashtag #VIP Lounge Bias began trending nationally. News networks sent camera crews to the Atlanta airport to film the lounge where the incident had occurred. Aviation blogs dissected every element of the encounter. Think tanks began commissioning research about discrimination in the aviation industry. Captain Richard Harrison's name, face, and airline affiliation became public knowledge within 48 hours. His home address was doxed by activists convinced that public pressure was the only justice that would be served. He received hundreds of emails, some expressing support, many more expressing condemnation. Local news crews showed up at his house. Protesters gathered outside his neighborhood with signs calling for his termination. But they also showed up at Delta Airlines headquarters. Delta responded swiftly, understanding that the incident had become a public relations crisis of significant magnitude. The airline issued a statement expressing concern about discriminatory treatment and committing to a thorough investigation. They announced that Captain Harrison would be suspended pending the results of that investigation. In the statement, they emphasized their commitment to diversity and inclusion, their zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, and their intention to use this incident as a catalyst for systemic change. The Federal Aviation Administration launched its own investigation, though notably, Marcus did not request it. His position was that he wanted the focus to remain on systemic change rather than individual punishment. Nevertheless, the incident had occurred in a heavily witnessed public setting, and regulatory bodies had procedures that had to be followed. The FAA's Office of Diversity and Inclusion opened a formal investigation into Captain Harrison's conduct. They interviewed every witness present in the lounge. They reviewed security footage from the airport's cameras. They examined whether Delta Airlines had violated any employment or regulatory standards. Captain Harrison found himself at the center of a maelstrom he hadn't anticipated. His suspension was announced, and suddenly, the details of his career became public fodder for discussion. News outlets revealed that he had been involved in 3 previous incidents that could be interpreted as racially insensitive, incidents that had never been formally investigated, but that now seemed deeply relevant. One incident involved a comment he'd made to a black flight attendant about her hair. Another involved a complaint from a black passenger who claimed Harrison had subjected them to additional security screening without cause. A third involved a hearing decision where Harrison, as a union representative, had allegedly opposed the hearing of a black female pilot. Suddenly, the incident in the VIP lounge wasn't seen as an isolated moment of poor judgment. It was seen as part of a pattern that had been allowed to continue for years without serious consequence. Harrison's union provided him with legal representation, but even they seemed uncertain about how to defend him. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses numerous, the video recording of Marcus's statement undeniable. The narrative was set. A white pilot had discriminated against a black executive, and that executive had responded with grace and wisdom. There was no good way to spin that. The incident spawned 1,000 conversations, in thousands of workplaces, in thousands of homes. Parents talked to their children about it. Business schools used it as a case study. Diversity training programs incorporated it into their curricula. The aviation industry, which had long struggled with diversity and inclusion issues, was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about systemic racism within its ranks. Airlines across the country began reviewing their own policies and procedures. They launched mandatory unconscious bias training programs for all staff members, from pilots to ground crew to administrative personnel. They established anonymous reporting mechanisms for discrimination. They began tracking incidents of bias and prejudice with new scrutiny. The incident became a catalyst for change that rippled through the entire industry. Captain Harrison's suspension extended for months. The investigation was thorough and comprehensive. Witness after witness testified about his behavior, about the pattern of incidents that had preceded this moment, about the culture of subtle racism that had allowed his behavior to go unchecked for so long. The evidence mounted, damning and irrefutable. But something unexpected happened as well. As the investigation progressed, Harrison began a genuine process of self-examination. He hired a therapist who specialized in racial reconciliation. He attended unconscious bias training seminars. He read extensively about systemic racism and the lived experience of people of color in the aviation industry. He began to understand, at a level that was far deeper than the performative apologies he'd issued in the lounge, what he had done and what it meant. He wrote letters, multiple letters, to Marcus Williams, expressing his remorse and his commitment to change. He requested to attend anti-bias training sessions led by organizations committed to dismantling racism in the workplace. He began speaking anonymously about his experience, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unconscious bias. The media coverage didn't stop. If anything, it intensified as new developments emerged. The investigation revealed systemic failures within Delta Airlines' diversity and inclusion programs. They revealed that complaints about Harrison had been filed years earlier, but had never been properly investigated. They revealed a culture within certain segments of the aviation industry that was actively hostile to people of color. Public opinion remained largely critical of Captain Harrison. Online petitions demanded his permanent termination. Activists argued that he should lose his commercial pilot's license. But a smaller but growing segment of the public began to see his journey toward genuine change as meaningful and noteworthy, a model for how perpetrators of discrimination could actually transform themselves. The incident that had started in a quiet moment in an airport VIP lounge had become a national conversation about race, bias, power, and the possibility of redemption. And it showed no signs of stopping. The reverberations would continue for years to come, reshaping policies, changing minds, and forcing uncomfortable conversations about the nature of discrimination in American institutions. 6 months after the incident in the Atlanta airport lounge, the aviation industry looked different. Not transformed overnight. Systemic change never works that way, but visibly, measurably different in ways that suggested something fundamental had shifted. The FAA, under Marcus Williams's leadership, launched the most comprehensive diversity and inclusion initiative in the agency's history. They established a new office dedicated specifically to addressing bias and discrimination within the aviation sector. They implemented mandatory training for all commercial pilots, not just about technical procedures, but about unconscious bias, cultural competency, and the lived experiences of people from marginalized communities. The training wasn't perfunctory. It was rigorous, challenging, and designed to provoke genuine reflection rather than simple compliance. More significantly, Marcus had established the Aviation Leadership Mentorship Program, a comprehensive initiative aimed at creating pathways for young pilots and aviation professionals of color to rise through the ranks of an industry that had historically excluded them. The program paired promising early career professionals with established mentors in positions of authority, providing not just guidance, but also advocacy, sponsorship, and access to the networks that had traditionally been closed to people who didn't look a certain way. The response to the mentorship program had been extraordinary. Within the first year, the program had enrolled over 300 participants. Major airlines, recognizing both the moral imperative and the business advantage of diversifying their workforce, began actively recruiting from the program. Flight schools that had historically served predominantly white populations began reaching out to minority communities, actively seeking to broaden their applicant pools. The conversation within aviation shifted from, "Can we afford to be diverse?" to "How can we accelerate diversification?" Delta Airlines, facing significant public pressure and internal reckoning, underwent a comprehensive overhaul of its policies and procedures. They appointed a new chief diversity officer who reported directly to the CEO. They set specific, measurable targets for increasing representation of people of color at every level of the organization, from pilots to mechanics to administrative positions. They established an anonymous reporting system for incidents of discrimination and committed to investigating every report thoroughly and transparently. The airline allocated significant resources to bias training and created support groups for employees of color who had experienced discrimination. Captain Richard Harrison emerged from his suspension transformed, though not without lasting consequences. The investigation had resulted in a formal reprimand in his personnel file and a requirement that he undergo ongoing bias training. But more importantly, Harrison had undergone a profound personal transformation. He became, somewhat unexpectedly, one of the most vocal advocates for change within the pilot community. Harrison began speaking at industry conferences about his experience, about what he had learned, and about the urgent necessity for systemic change. He didn't shy away from the difficult truths about his own racism or the racism embedded in the structures of the aviation industry. Instead, he spoke about them directly, unflinchingly, with a kind of hard-won authenticity that came from genuine reckoning with himself. "I spent 32 years believing I was one of the good guys," Harrison told a room full of aviation professionals at a major industry conference. "I followed the rules. I maintained standards. I took pride in being professional. And the entire time, I was perpetuating a system that excluded people based on race. That's the insidious nature of systemic racism. It allows people to believe they're not part of the problem while actively participating in exclusion." His words were met with a standing ovation from many in the audience, though not all. Some pilots, particularly older ones, seemed uncomfortable with what Harrison was saying. But the silence from those critics was itself significant, a sign that the cultural conversation had shifted, that publicly defending racism or dismissing concerns about discrimination was becoming increasingly untenable. Marcus Williams used his position to drive change at the highest levels of the aviation industry. He met with airline CEOs, aircraft manufacturers, and aviation regulatory bodies around the world. He pushed for international standards on diversity and inclusion, advocating that representation should be a priority not just in the United States but globally. He commissioned research into the barriers that prevented people of color from advancing in aviation, and then used that research to inform policy changes. The FAA issued new guidance to all commercial airlines regarding diversity requirements for pilot hearing and advancement. While the guidance stopped short of mandating specific percentages, which would have been legally problematic, it established clear expectations that airlines would be held accountable for demonstrating meaningful progress toward greater diversity. Airlines that failed to show progress risked regulatory scrutiny and potential consequences. Educational institutions changed as well. Flight schools, which had historically been gatekeepers for the aviation industry, began examining their own biases and barriers. They increased recruitment efforts in minority communities, established scholarship programs for students of color, and created mentorship programs connecting aspiring pilots with established professionals. Major universities began offering aviation programs that explicitly welcomed diverse student bodies. 1 year after the incident, the first cohort of the Aviation Leadership Mentorship Program graduated. 35 young pilots of color completed the program and received job offers from major airlines. Among them was a young black woman named Angela Torres, who became one of the first Latina commercial pilots hired by American Airlines. At her graduation ceremony from the mentorship program, Marcus presented her with her completion certificate, and the symbolism was not lost on anyone in the room. 2 years ago, people like Angela would have faced barriers at every step, Marcus said at that ceremony. They would have had to work twice as hard to achieve half as much. That's still true to some extent. Systemic racism doesn't disappear because of a single incident or a single program. But what has changed is visibility. What has changed is intention. What has changed is the commitment of an entire industry to do better. The incident became a case study in business schools and diversity training programs around the world. Harvard Business School commissioned a detailed analysis of the incident and Marcus's response, making it required reading in their leadership courses. The case study examined how one moment of confrontation had become a catalyst for systemic change, how one person's dignified response to discrimination had reverberated through an entire industry. Captain Harrison was never fully rehabilitated in the court of public opinion. There remained those who believed he should have lost his license entirely, who saw his transformation as insufficient redemption for his years of racist behavior. But he continued his work, continued speaking, continued using his platform to advocate for change. He established a foundation dedicated to supporting diversity initiatives in aviation. He became an unlikely symbol of how people could transform themselves when confronted with the reality of their own bias. The aviation industry, by most measures, was meaningfully different 5 years after the incident. The percentage of black pilots had increased noticeably. Women in aviation, particularly women of color, reported fewer incidents of harassment and discrimination. The cultural conversation within the industry had shifted. Diversity and inclusion were no longer afterthoughts but central to organizational strategy. But perhaps the most lasting impact was simply this: an entire industry had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about itself. An industry had acknowledged its racism, its exclusion, its systemic barriers to advancement, and it had committed, however imperfectly, to doing better. That afternoon in the Atlanta airport lounge had been just one moment, but that moment had opened a door that could never be closed, a door that revealed the possibility that change, real, meaningful, systemic change, was possible. And in that possibility lay the hope for a more equitable future.